Mr. Speaker, about political spin in the so-called Rumsfeld document. The Rumsfeld plan that we outlined in this House, which was the secret document that became public by some intrepid people that were involved with planning that document, decided that Nova Scotians should know about it. And we found out in that document that it was a feel-good document. The message was, no matter if you're doing anything for Nova Scotians, doesn't matter. Just make them think you're doing something for them. Make them feel good. So if they feel good, they'll think something's happening. And if they think something's happening, they'll vote for us in the next election. Be happy. Don't worry about anything. That's what the Rumsfeld plan said. Propaganda. Get us through the next election. Now, Mr. Speaker, in the past year, the government's increased the tobacco tax by $50 million a year. And they put back $1 million to support Nova Scotians who want to quit smoking. $1 million out of the 50. They increased the taxes, $50 million, put one back. That's a real commitment, to stop people from smoking. And Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians have the highest rates of death from respiratory disease. And there's been no real action, Mr. Speaker, on establishing community health centres, which would help Nova Scotians manage their own health better. And Mr. Speaker, I want to leave health care for a moment because everybody in Nova Scotia knows, Mr. Speaker, that the government has been throwing more money at the health care system, but the system is still broke. No plan. There's no plan. The people who are working in the system are overworked and frustrated with the lack of attention to their needs by this government. It's not the people working in the health care system in this province that are at fault. It is the administration of that health care system that's at fault. It's a lack of a plan by this government, a long-term plan that Nova Scotians can finally see that there's something happening incrementally in our health care system in the future. That's not happening. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me turn to some matters about education for a moment. You know, Mr. Speaker, I know, and all Nova Scotians know that our education system is failing our students. Students are failing in math and English. The government has announced plans for new schools. But children in Dominion are watching their schools sink. Children in Barrington are coming home sick. And on the Eastern Shore, the high school doesn't meet the fire code. Doesn't meet the fire code in the year 2003. Declining enrollment. Overall, this province schools have a maintenance requirement of $500 million. In HRM, students are facing problems unique to this particular area as well. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that the same thing goes for education that I outlined in health. There is no plan for education in this province in the future except to get from one day to the next. Post-secondary education, Mr. Speaker, as I outlined briefly earlier, Nova Scotia students have the highest tuition in the country. The present Tory government used the Millennium money, as I stated, the scholarship fund, in a way that said to the students that you don't matter here. You don't matter, students. We're going to use this money for other purposes. We don't think it should go to you, the students in this province who need it. In other words, Mr. Speaker, the government ripped that money right out of the pockets of the students who need it in this province and thought nothing of it. Now, the new loan remission program that I mentioned earlier offers only $5.1 million compared with the $10 million they took from the students. So again, it's this shell game this government is playing with Nova Scotians. We take 100% from you, give you 50% back, and hope you think we're wonderful as we head into an election. The illusion that you're actually doing something for Nova Scotians. Well, I give the people of Nova Scotia more credit than that. They can see through this cynical political game that's going on here. They can see through the fact that this government is about to announce a 10% income tax decrease in this province, when in fact, The increases announced federally 2 years ago were not allowed to flow through here. The province kept that as well. So people from Nova Scotia did not get the benefit of that. And you're using borrowed money to give a tax break back to Nova Scotians this year. I see I've struck a chord, Mr. Speaker, with those opposite when you start talking taxes. Who's going to benefit from this tax decrease? Low-income people in this province? Remember, it's only on the provincial income tax. So low-income people, how much are they going to benefit? $4 or $5 a month, maybe? Something like that. $50 a year. When in fact you've charged them more for license plates now, you've charged them more for licenses of all kinds. Every single gas has gone up at the pump. The government has done nothing about the increase in home heating oil, the increase in insurance, but yet the government is going to give a 10% tax break when in fact not only are they charging the user fees but they're borrowing the money to get the tax break back in an election year. This government's borrowed another $100 million this year to get them through, and $500 million in borrowed money since the Premier said he would not borrow any money in his first term of office in this province. Yet, consistently, this government has borrowed to operate each and every year. And the finance minister has the gall to stand in this House and say that he's got a truly balanced budget. It's not difficult to achieve a balanced budget when you're out borrowing money. It's called checkbook politics, post-dated checkbook politics. The whole exercise here with this speech from the throne is to get this government through the next election, no matter what. Tell Nova Scotians what the Rumsfeld plan stated. Don't worry, be happy. That's right. Now, Mr. Speaker, I believe, Mr. Speaker, that as we move steadily towards the election, you're going to see more political advertising paid for by the taxpayers. You're going to see more announcements made on policy decisions of this government before they're even debated on the floor of this place, where they should be debated. You have the spectacle of the Premier standing in another place telling Nova Scotians there's going to be a tax decrease before we even see the budget here, before we even vote on a budget for a tax decrease or any other part of that budget. They're already out buying ads saying this is a done deal, paid for by the taxpayers in Nova Scotia, paying for an ad to tell them they're going to get a tax decrease before this House even approves it. That's the contempt that this government has for this parliamentary system. But I believe that Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, are not going to be fooled by that. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me turn for a moment to the other part of the speech from the throne that I thought was peculiar. Very little mention of the offshore industry, passing glance at it. But worse than that, Mr. Speaker, my own area. 8 lines in the total document devoted to Cape Breton. 8 lines. One reminding Nova Scotians that the stacks are gone at Cisco again. They're gone, they made sure of that. But they want to remind Nova Scotians again in their speech to curry favor with whomever by reminding them that we knocked the stacks down a few years ago. And reminding Nova Scotians, again in those 8 lines devoted to Cape Breton, reminding Nova Scotians that they're going to be involved in the tar ponds cleanup. They're going to be involved in the tar ponds cleanup. Whenever they can figure out what percentage of the money they're going to have to come to the table with. And that project is federally driven, has been for a long time, and it's through the efforts of local groups that have ensured that program remains very much doable. I believe, Mr. Speaker, as I stand in my place here, that this government has forgotten about Cape Breton and has written it off. when you have a document that has 8 lines dedicated to Cape Breton, it speaks volumes about not an economic or a social agenda for this government, but a political agenda. This government knows that politically Cape Breton is a wasteland for them. They know that because of past decisions made by ministers, either current or in the past, respecting Cape Breton. So what have they done? It's called political retribution. They're saying, yes, Cisco closed, hospital beds open, according to the... But the Cisco's gone, we know that, but there's no more hospital beds. They're closing them too. So, you know. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm disappointed about the lack of any kind of statement in the document that we heard yesterday respecting a long-term strategy to solve the economic problems of rural Nova Scotia and Cape Breton. And when I talk about rural Nova Scotia, the tremendous problems that are inherent in a lot of areas in this province, including areas from Yarmouth to Glace Bay that are in rural Nova Scotia. I believe this government has decided where they can score political points and are turning their attention to those areas only. Just look at what's happening in the paving industry, I guess, the transportation industry, but as we move closer to the election, I refer to it as the paving industry in Nova Scotia. Tory ridings are getting the majority of the work, but that's understandable. They're going to zero in on what seats they can win, and they're going to spend money in those particular seats. Another political exercise. But again, they're trying to get elected with public dollars. It's not what all Nova Scotians want and need. It's what they feel Nova Scotians that are supportive of them should get. That's exactly what kind of an exercise is going on there. Some of the agreements that have been negotiated across this country are much better than the one that was negotiated from Nova Scotia with Ottawa in terms of transportation monies. And we wonder why the ball was dropped here, you know, and I see the government House Leader smiling about that. Well, you know, the government House Leader is pretty quick on his feet today regarding that, and he'll have an opportunity to discuss that and maybe at some point debate in this House exactly what he means by that. But I can tell you, this government did not do a very good job of negotiating monies for Nova Scotia in regards to transportation, in my opinion. Yeah. And by the way, we had the spectacle of government getting mixed up from one minister to another of what the priorities were. Suddenly, one highway was a priority one day and another one the next day, and then they had to backtrack on that, and then they weren't sure which one was going to be the priority.
104, 103, 101.
Yeah, take your pick. They're all priorities, I guess.
It changes depending on what the
yeah. But Mr. Speaker, 101 is the priority now. Mr. Speaker, I want to conclude my remarks in a few moments by talking about the lack of a vision of this government, a lack of a plan of this government. The only plan that seems to be evident is the government's plan to get re-elected at any cost. And that particular plan is something that we have to be challenged because of now every government wants to get re-elected, there's no question about that, but it's how a government gets re-elected. It's how a government will try to convince Nova Scotians they're actually giving them something back when in fact they've taken it from them in the first place. And that in regards to tax decreases is the same with plans to help senior citizens or plans to help those less fortunate. Mr. Speaker, we have a situation here as well where people in this government are trying their best to put a good face on what the government is not doing in this province. There was very little mention in this document, the speech thrown yesterday as well, of people who are less fortunate in this province. Very little reference made to whether or not this government is going to increase assistance to those in need in this province. People out there are hurting. People in Nova Scotia, from one end of this province to another, are hurting. They're hurting in high oil costs in their homes. They're hurting in trying to heat their houses, but they're also hurting when they go to the pumps for gasoline. They're hurting when they can't pay house insurance, and that house insurance is canceled on them. All of these things are having an impact on all Nova Scotians, but imagine what kind of an impact they're having on low-income Nova Scotians. I think it's tragic that the government has not turned its attention to doing something about people in this province who do not have adequate income to face these rising costs. And the government pays very little attention to it, if any, in the document. The government states that the economy is good, that we don't need the offshore in the future. If they want to leave the province, that's fine with this government. No plan to do anything other than say goodbye to them. There's no plans to help people with insurance costs, except to put a consultative process out there that will take months and perhaps a year to get done. And that time the election will have come and gone. When people need assistance now, they need it today in rising insurance costs. They need it today in assistance with high gasoline costs. They need it today with a reduction in home heating oil costs and other sources of power costs in the homes here in Nova Scotia. There has to be something done about the injustice when people are arbitrarily cut off insurance because insurers simply don't want to insure them anymore, or that they can't afford to pay the insurance. There's something wrong in our province when that's allowed to happen in the year 2003. That people literally have to live in a house they can't insure or can't afford home heating oil and have to go without in the dead of winter. Consultation is not what's needed to solve those problems. Action by this government is what's needed to solve those problems. And Mr. Speaker, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention this over again. The tax cut that's taking place this year, if it does, is only money that have been stripped from the pockets of Nova Scotians already. Number one, with user fees. Number two, increased gas taxes when this Premier assured Nova Scotians he would not increase taxes, and he broke that promise to Nova Scotians. Another broken promise. And number three, Mr. Speaker, the finance minister stands in his place and the Premier proudly proclaims that he's having a balanced budget when in fact he's borrowing $100 million a year. You know, checkbook politics. How do you explain that to people? That how can you say there's a tax cut or you balance the budget when the long-term debt is growing in this province to $500 million? You know, if the member from Preston wants to get involved in this debate, Mr. Speaker, he should get on his feet, you know, and reply to the speech from the throne. The only thing he's contributed here in 4 years is walking around the floor of this place looking like he's important, you know, but I digress, Mr. Speaker, I digress. But there's an interesting analogy, better on a checkbook than a credit card, the member from Preston states. Well, there you go. You know, there you go. $500 million later, that would sound like a previous Tory government's analogy of that, wouldn't it? You know, I mean, $500 million has been borrowed in this province since the Tory government took over. Long-term debt. When the Premier said there wouldn't be a cent on the long-term debt in this province. So how can any finance minister stand in his place and say we've balanced the budget when the third largest item of expenditure in this province is a repayment of debt and growing? I mean, it was the Premier of Nova Scotia said there'd be no increase in the long-term debt in this province. It was the Finance Minister that said that.
It wasn't the member from Preston.
It wasn't the member from Preston. Yeah, he doesn't understand it anyway. But, Mr. Speaker, before I take my place, I just want to remind Nova Scotians again that any tax decrease to the amount of 10% to Nova Scotians this year is not going to benefit low-income people in this province, or even, I suggest, middle-income people in this province. It's not going to benefit them because they've already been stripped. They've already been charged too much increase on gasoline. They've already been paid that out in user fees. But they, as custodians of the public purse of Nova Scotia, have said, we are going to give you a 10% tax decrease, but we're going to borrow the money to do it. We're going to borrow the money to get us through this election. And if we don't get reelected, it'll be somebody else's problem after the election's over. If we get reelected, we'll deal with it then. That's the modus operandi of this government, and anybody can see that. But, Mr. Speaker, I take exception as a Nova Scotian to this government using my tax dollars for political purposes in terms of advertising to get this crowd reelected again. Mr. Speaker, and I think Nova Scotians over the next days and weeks should pay close attention to what this budget comes in with this year and the exercise that's going to be put in place by this government to, Mr. Speaker, bridge them to election. That's why you have committees that will consult on insurance rates. Not do anything about it, just consult on them. You know, well, what a piercing glance at the obvious, Mr. Speaker. We're going to consult on why insurance rates are so high in this province. You know, we're going to consult on it instead of doing something about it. Where were they a year ago when we suggested an all-party committee? They, a year ago, didn't agree, and neither did the NDP. It's only lately that the light's gone on in that party as to the fact that they need to get on the bandwagon about insurance rates when we were doing that on that and on home heating oil and on gasoline a year ago. A year ago. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that as the days and weeks evolve over the next little while, you're going to hear from this side of the House. Our party is going to come forward, Mr. Speaker, with some progressive ideas for the future of the province of Nova Scotia, and we are going to hold this government accountable over the course of this session. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Colchester-Musqueam Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, at this time of great uncertainty and unrest in the world, I am absolutely honored to rise in my place in this home of the first responsible government in the British Empire, Mr. Speaker. I was extremely pleased yesterday that members agreed to observe a moment of prayer and reflection. And it was important that we recognize from time to time, especially in this time of uncertainty and unrest and unease in the world, how fortunate we are to live in a democracy where freedom and peace have been achieved through a lot of hard work and a lot of sacrifices. And it's a tribute to the military people in this country, Mr. Speaker. And I was delighted that all people agreed to observe that moment of silence, all members that were present. Mr. Speaker, earlier on, I indicated how pleased I was to rise in my place in response to the throne speech. And, Mr. Speaker, everything being equal, very shortly I will have 10 years in as a provincial MLA, and I'm very pleased to be able to say that. I enjoy immensely the job. I enjoy working with my constituents, and it really is a privilege. As the honourable member from Cape Breton South alluded to earlier, it's a privilege and an honour to represent your constituents. And, you know, Mr. Speaker, I want to speak about some concerns that I have and some comments about the Halifax International Airport, about sawmills in the beautiful Colchester-Musqueam Valley, about farms, and, of course, about the much-hated federal Liberal gun registry. And again, I want to point out how proud I was that the federal Tories, the Canadian Alliance, and the NDP voted against that extra appropriation of some $59 million to add to the $1 billion boondoggle that they have created. So, Mr. Speaker, I know the clock is ticking away here today, and it is Friday and so on, Mr. Speaker, and with your approbation, I'd like to just adjourn my response to the throne speech at this time and perhaps be able to carry on it another day. So I would ask if I could do that, Mr. Speaker.
Motion to adjourn debate. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask for concurrence of the House to revert to the order of business, tabling reports, regulations, and other papers.
Is it agreed? At this time, on behalf of the Review Officer, Mr. Darce Fardy, I'd like to table the end report for the period October 1, 2001 to December 31st, 2002, Nova Scotia Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Review Office annual report. So table it with the clerk. Copies will be dispersed to all members now. Yes. Thank you. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, that concludes the government's business for today, and I move that the House to now rise to meet again on Monday at the hour of 7 p.m. We'll sit from 7 p.m. until 10 p.m., and the order of business, Mr. Speaker, will be resumption of the adjourned debate on the speech from the throne. So, Mr. Speaker, I wish everybody a happy weekend.
Motion to adjourn until 7 p.m. on Monday. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded, nay. Motion is carried. We adjourn to 7 p.m. on Monday.